There is a sentence that still lives in my chest like a splinter. My mother said it so lightly, so carelessly, that she probably forgot it the moment it left her mouth. But I never forgot it. She said, "Don't worry, it's just going to be a little party." She was talking about my wedding. I remember exactly where I was standing when she said it. In the kitchen, by the window that never closed all the way, holding a folder of wedding ideas I had been building since I was 19 years old. Fabric samples cut into little squares, photographs torn from magazines, a small spiral notebook where I had written down, in careful teenage handwriting, the kind of music I wanted playing when I finally walked down the aisle. My mother looked at that folder the way you look at a child's drawing right before you quietly slide it into the recycling bin. Fondly, dismissively, as though it belonged to a version of me she had already outgrown on my behalf. "A little party," she said again, as if repeating it would somehow make it hurt less, as if saying it twice would turn it into a kindness instead of a sentence. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is that I was 28 years old, and I had spent the better part of a decade imagining a day that, piece by piece, was being quietly dismantled in front of me by the two people who were supposed to want it most. I want to tell you, before this story goes any further, that I loved my parents. I still do, in the complicated way you love people who raised you and also wounded you, sometimes in the very same breath, sometimes in the very same sentence. My father worked for almost 20 years at a shipping and logistics company, climbing slowly from a warehouse coordinator to a regional operations manager. It was not an easy climb. He used to come home smelling of diesel and cardboard and exhaustion, his shirt collar always a half shade darker than the rest of the fabric from years of sweat and long shifts. My mother used to stretch every rupee, every dollar, every unit of our currency until it screamed, turning leftover vegetables into 3 different meals, patching my school uniforms instead of replacing them, saying no to almost everything so that, eventually, she could say yes to the things that mattered. I grew up watching them sacrifice comfort for stability, again and again, without complaint, without asking for gratitude. So when they told me my wedding needed to be small, I told myself it was about money. I told myself it was practical, the same practicality that had built our entire household. I told myself a lot of things that year, because the alternative, that it was about something else entirely, something uglier and quieter than money, was too painful to sit with for very long. I was marrying a man named Aiden. I need to tell you about him now, at the very beginning, because he is the second heartbeat of this story, and nothing that happens later will make sense without understanding who he was to me before the world outside our apartment ever learned his name. I met Aiden on an ordinary Tuesday, in a coffee shop 2 blocks from the office where I worked as a junior editor, back when my biggest worry in life was whether a manuscript deadline would slip by another week. He was sitting alone with a laptop that had a cracked corner held together with tape, 3 different colored pens lined up beside it like soldiers, and an expression of total, focused concentration that made him look, from a distance, faintly irritated at the world. I only spoke to him because the coffee shop had run out of chairs, and he was the only person sitting alone at a table built for 4. "Do you mind?" I asked, gesturing at the empty seat across from him. He looked up, blinked once as though surfacing from somewhere deep, and said, "Only if you don't mind me typing while you eat. I'm terrible company today." He was not terrible company. He was, in fact, the best company I had encountered in years. Quiet in a way that made people underestimate him, careful with his words in a way that made the ones he chose to say feel weighted, worth listening to. We talked for 40 minutes that first day, about nothing important. A book he was reading, a documentary I'd half-watched the night before, and I left the coffee shop without his number, mildly annoyed at myself for not asking. He found me again 3 days later, at the same table, with 2 coffees instead of 1. "I asked the barista what you usually order," he admitted, sliding one across the table. "I hope that's not strange." It was strange. It was also somehow exactly right. Aiden wore the same 3 shirts on rotation for the better part of a year that I knew him. Soft faded, the kind of shirts a man buys once and simply keeps because they still fit, and there's no reason to replace something that still works. He drove an old car with a door that didn't close properly unless you slammed it just right. A small ritual he performed every single time without ever once complaining about getting it fixed. He worked, as far as I understood in those early months, in consulting, which is such a vague and elastic word that people use it the way they use fog, to obscure rather than reveal. I didn't push for more detail because it never occurred to me that there was more to push for. He talked about his work in careful, general terms: deals, negotiations, long nights, difficult clients. The way anyone talks about a job that consumes them without wanting to bore the person across the table with the specifics. I assumed, the way you assume things about people you love before you've had reason to question them, that his vagueness was simple modesty. I had no idea it was something closer to caution. When I first brought him home, 6 months into our relationship, my father shook his hand for exactly 2 seconds, and then returned to his newspaper without another word. My mother asked him 3 questions in quick succession: where his family was from, what his father did for a living, and finally, delicately, what his own prospects were. And when his answers didn't produce the reaction she was hoping for, she never asked again. I watched her file him away in real time, the way you watch someone close a drawer. Acceptable, her expression seemed to say, but not exciting. Not the kind of son-in-law you brag about at dinner parties. I didn't understand it then. I do now. My parents had spent their whole lives being looked past by people who had more money, more title, more shine, more of the invisible currency that makes rooms go quiet when certain names are spoken. And somewhere in that long, slow erosion of being overlooked, they had built a private hierarchy of worth without ever meaning to, a silent ranking system they applied to everyone who entered our lives, including eventually the man I loved. Not because Aiden had done anything wrong. Simply because he did not look, on paper, like a man who would make them proud in front of other people. He didn't wear a title like armor. He didn't announce himself. And so my parents, without ever saying it out loud, quietly decided he was less than what I deserved, even as they never once articulated what, exactly, I deserved instead. That is what a little party really meant in the end. It didn't mean we don't have enough money. It meant we don't want to invite our world to witness this. I found that out for certain on the morning of my wedding, and by then, it was already too late for me to fix quietly. It would take a stranger, my father's own boss, to tear the truth into the open, in front of everyone, in a single sentence that changed the temperature of an entire room. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this really begins. Not on the wedding day, but months before it, in the slow, aching weeks when I first started to feel the shape of my parents' shame. Aiden proposed to me on a rooftop in late autumn, with a ring he had clearly agonized over and a speech he had clearly rehearsed, and then abandoned halfway through in favor of simply saying, "I don't want to spend a single year of my life without you in it." I said yes before he even finished getting down on one knee properly, which made us both laugh so hard that a neighbor 2 buildings over leaned out of her window to see what the commotion was. I called my parents that same night, giddy, breathless, holding the phone away from my ear, so I wouldn't damage my own hearing with how loudly I was smiling. "He proposed," I said. "Mom, Dad, he proposed." There was a pause on the line. Not a long one. Half a second, maybe less. But I heard it, the way you hear a single wrong note in an otherwise familiar song. "That's wonderful, Beta," my mother said, and her voice was warm enough that I nearly missed the flatness underneath it. "We're so happy for you." My father, on the extension, added, "Congratulations. Bring him by this weekend. We should talk about plans." Plans. Even then, I should have paid closer attention to that word, to the careful, businesslike weight my father put on it, as though my wedding were a logistics problem to be solved rather than a joy to be celebrated. But I was 27 and engaged and floating somewhere 3 feet above the ground, and I let the pause pass without examining it. I told myself families are always a little strange on big news. I told myself the excitement would come later, once it settled in. I told myself, for the first of what would become many times that year, a story that let me keep loving them without asking the harder questions underneath. I had imagined, the way most daughters do, a wedding full of noise and color. Cousins dancing badly to songs they didn't actually like, my father's old college friends telling embarrassing stories about him that would make my mother swat at his arm in mock outrage, my mother crying happy tears into a tissue she'd insist, through her sniffling, that she didn't need. Instead, 3 weeks after the engagement, my mother sat me down at the kitchen table, and handed me a list with 14 names on it. 14? I asked, certain I had misheard her, certain the number would rearrange itself into something larger if I simply looked again. We don't want to make a big fuss, she said, not quite meeting my eyes, her attention very deliberately fixed on the pot simmering on the stove behind her. Weddings these days are so showy, so wasteful. We're simple people. We've always been simple people. Simple people. That phrase would return to haunt me later, because nothing about what followed was simple at all. It was calculated. It was careful, in the way that only deeply anxious people are careful, weighing every name against some invisible risk I couldn't yet see. It was, I would come to realize many months later, an act of quiet self-protection dressed up as humility, a wall built brick by brick and disguised as modesty. I tried to push back, gently at first. I asked if we could at least invite my father's colleagues, the people he had worked alongside for 2 decades, the people who had watched him rise slowly and painfully from the warehouse floor to a manager's office, the people whose names he mentioned so often at dinner that I felt like I half knew them myself. My mother's hand paused over the pot, just for a second, but I saw it, the smallest hitch in her rhythm like a record skipping. No, she said. This isn't about them. This is about family. I should have asked, right then, why my father's entire professional life, a life he was, in every other conversation, so quietly proud of, had suddenly become something to keep at arm's length from his own daughter's wedding. But I didn't ask. I was 28 and in love and exhausted from months of half-hearted wedding planning. And some quiet, self-preserving part of me didn't want to hear the answer that was already forming, unwelcome, at the edges of my mind. Aiden noticed it too, though he was gentler about naming it than I was. He always was, gentler, slower to accuse, quicker to find an explanation that spared everyone's feelings, including people who had done very little to earn that grace. Do you think, he asked me one night, lying beside me with his hand resting lightly on my stomach the way he always did when he was working through something carefully, turning it over like a stone in his palm, that they're embarrassed of me? No, I said too quickly, the denial leaving my mouth before I had even fully considered the question. It's not you. It's money. It's stress. It's a lot of things probably. My parents get strange about big events. They always have. He didn't argue. He just nodded in that quiet way of his and said, okay. But I felt something settle behind his eyes that night, something that looked a little like resignation, a little like a door being closed softly rather than slammed. Aiden was the kind of man who absorbed pain without performing it, who let disappointment move through him privately rather than announcing itself. He didn't yell. He didn't demand explanations. He simply adjusted his expectations downward, the way people do when they've been disappointed by families before, his own included, though that is a different story, one he told me only in pieces late at night, over the following months, and had learned, the hard way, not to expect very much from new ones. What I didn't know, what none of us in that small apartment with the 2 thin walls could have known, was that Aiden was carrying an entire life my family had never bothered to ask about closely enough to discover. Not because he was hiding it dramatically, like some secret identity waiting behind a curtain for the right cue to be unveiled. He simply never volunteered information to people who had already, quietly, decided not to be curious about him. That is the peculiar cruelty of underestimating someone. You stop asking questions, and so you never, ever learn the answers, and the not knowing becomes its own kind of wall, built by inattention rather than malice, but a wall all the same. The months moved forward the way wedding months do. Fast in memory, agonizingly slow in the actual living of them. My mother trimmed the guest list further, from 14 to 12, citing a caterer's minimum spend policy that I later learned, from the caterer herself, did not exist. My father, when I brought up the subject at all, would simply say, "Whatever your mother wants," and return to his newspaper, folding it with the same practiced motion he used to end every conversation he didn't want to continue. I told myself this was just how my parents processed stress. Through withdrawal, through delegation, through a kind of domestic conflict avoidance that had kept their marriage running smoothly for 31 years. I told myself the wedding didn't need to be big to be meaningful. I told myself, over and over, the story that let me keep loving them without asking the harder questions. But there were moments the mask slipped, small fractures in the surface that I noticed and then out of some instinct for self-preservation, chose not to press. Once my mother was on the phone with her sister, my aunt, and I overheard her say, in a voice pitched lower than her usual telephone register, "We're keeping it small, because of circumstances." A pause. Then even lower, almost embarrassed, almost apologetic. "You know how people talk?" I asked her later, standing in the hallway outside her bedroom, what she had meant by circumstances. "Nothing," she said too fast, folding a towel with unnecessary precision. "You're imagining things. You've always had an active imagination, even as a little girl." Another time, weeks later, I was looking for a stapler in my mother's small home office and found, tucked beneath a stack of bills, an old draft of the invitation list in her handwriting. An earlier draft, from before the 14 names had even been finalized, with several additional names crossed out in heavy, decisive pen strokes, including, I noticed with a small cold twist low in my stomach, my father's entire department. Every single colleague he had ever mentioned by name at the dinner table. Every single person who had shared 2 decades of his working life with him. Who had watched him grow from a young man hauling boxes to a manager who signed off on shipments worth more than our house. Gone, all of them, with a single decisive stroke of a pen, as though they had never existed at all. When I asked him about it directly, one of the very few times I really pushed, cornering him in the garage where he was pretending to organize tools he had organized 100 times before. My father set down the wrench in his hand and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Something between shame and fear, the kind of look you give someone when you're deciding, in real time, how much of the truth you can afford to hand them. "It's complicated," he said, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it. "You wouldn't understand." "Try me," I said, and I meant it. I was ready, right there in that garage that smelled of motor oil and old cardboard, to hear whatever he had to say. He didn't take the chance. He picked the wrench back up, turned back to the pegboard of tools, and the conversation ended the way most difficult conversations in my family ended. Not with resolution, but with silence dressed up as finality. A door closing so gently you could almost pretend it hadn't closed at all. I didn't understand it then. I do now. And when I finally did understand it, it would come not from my father's mouth, but from a stranger's, standing in a rented banquet hall with a glass of champagne in his hand, staring at my husband as though he had seen a ghost rise up out of the carpet. I want to pause the story here, briefly, to tell you something I didn't fully understand until much later. Something about why Aiden never corrected my parents, never once, in all those months of quiet diminishment, said the words that would have changed everything instantly. Aiden had grown up the son of a man who built a modest hardware business from nothing, and who spent Aiden's entire childhood being courted, flattered, and eventually betrayed by relatives and so-called friends who suddenly discovered a deep and abiding love for the family the moment the business began to succeed. Aiden had watched his father write checks to cousins who never called except to ask for money, had watched people's warmth toward his family expand and contract in exact proportion to how well the business was doing that quarter. He had made a private vow, somewhere in his early 20s, that he would never again let money or title be the reason someone chose to love him, or his own future family. So when my parents treated him with polite, careful distance, when my mother filed him away as acceptable, but not exciting, Aiden made a decision. He decided he would rather be underestimated honestly than admired for the wrong reasons. He told me this, finally, on our wedding night, long after the truth had already exploded into the open without his permission. "I kept waiting," he said, "for a moment when your parents would ask me a real question. Not about my job title. About what mattered to me. About what kind of husband I wanted to be to you. I kept waiting for them to be curious about me. And when they weren't, I just let them believe whatever they wanted to believe. I told myself it didn't matter, because I wasn't marrying them. I was marrying you. It was, I would come to understand, both a beautiful principle and a costly one. Because his silence, however well-intentioned, left a vacuum. And into that vacuum, my parents poured all their own fears, all their own assumptions, all their own quiet, unexamined shame. If you want to understand exactly how deep my mother's discomfort ran, you had to be standing beside me in the dress shop 3 months before the wedding, watching her face while I stood on the small round platform in front of the three-way mirror. I had tried on a dress that made me feel, for the first time in the entire planning process, like a bride. Full skirt, delicate beading along the neckline, the kind of dress that makes a shop assistant gasp reflexively even though she's seen 100 brides that same week. I turned to my mother, waiting for her reaction, waiting for the tears I had always imagined this moment would bring. Instead, she glanced at the price tag still dangling from the sleeve, and her face did something complicated. A flicker of genuine appreciation, immediately smothered by something else. Calculation. Worry. It's beautiful, she said carefully. But maybe something simpler? We don't want to seem like we're overdoing it. Overdoing it for who? I asked. She didn't answer directly. She picked up a much plainer dress from the rack behind her. A dress I would later learn cost less than half as much, though money, I now understood, was never really the point, and held it up almost pleadingly. This one's lovely too, she said. Understated. Elegant. I bought the first dress anyway, using money I had saved myself, and I watched my mother's mouth tighten into a thin, resigned line as I handed over my own card at the register. She didn't say another word about it. But something about that afternoon stayed lodged in me. The particular flavor of her worry, which wasn't about extravagance at all. It was about visibility, about being seen and judged, and found wanting by whatever invisible audience lived permanently in her mind. 2 months before the wedding, I came home early from work with a headache, planning to lie down in the quiet of my old bedroom for an hour before heading back to my apartment. I let myself in through the side door, the way I had done 1,000 times as a teenager, and I heard my mother's voice drifting from the kitchen, low and urgent, the particular register she used only for conversations she didn't want overheard. I know, she was saying. But what if someone from Rajesh's office recognizes people there? What if word gets back to the Sharmas? A pause, listening. Then more sharply. You don't understand what it's like being the one everyone whispers about. We finally have a good position in this community. I'm not going to risk that over a party. A party. Not her daughter's wedding. A party. A liability to be managed, a reputational risk to be minimized. I stood frozen in the hallway, my headache momentarily forgotten, listening to my own mother describe the most important day of my life as a threat to her social standing. I didn't go into the kitchen. I didn't confront her. I turned around, quietly let myself back out the side door, and sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes before I trusted myself to drive. I never told her I'd heard that conversation. I carried it instead, a stone in my pocket, growing heavier by the week. It would be unfair to this story if I didn't tell you about the one dinner where Aiden's own parents came to meet mine. A dinner that revealed with painful clarity exactly what my family was missing. Aiden's mother, a warm, unhurried woman named Priya, arrived with a homemade dessert she'd clearly spent hours on. And within 10 minutes of sitting down at our table, she was asking my mother detailed, genuinely curious questions about her childhood, about how she and my father had met, about the recipes she'd grown up cooking. My mother, unused to this kind of attention, seemed almost flustered by it, unsure how to receive warmth that came with no hidden calculation attached. Aiden's father, a quiet, weathered man named Thomas, spent most of the dinner talking not about business or titles, but about the years he'd spent building his hardware shop from a single rented storefront, about the mistakes he'd made, about how proud he was that Aiden had built something of his own without ever once asking his father for a head start. He never wanted anyone's help, Thomas said, glancing fondly at his son. Told me once he wanted to know his success was actually his. Stubborn boy. Gets it from his mother. I watched my father listen to this with an expression I couldn't quite read. Something between admiration and discomfort, as though Thomas's easy pride in his son was a mirror held up to something my own father hadn't yet figured out how to feel about me, or about the man I'd chosen to marry. After Aiden's parents left that evening, my mother turned to me in the kitchen and said, almost involuntarily, "They seem like good people." "They are," I said. "So is their son." She didn't respond to that. She just began clearing plates, a little too quickly, a little too intently, as if the dishes required more concentration than they actually did. The wedding day itself began the way all my mother's careful minimizing had promised it would. Small, quiet, contained, folded neatly into itself like a letter no one particularly wanted to mail. 14 guests became 19 by the time cousins insisted their way onto the list at the last minute. A small victory I hadn't even had to fight for. A modest hall, rented for half a day. A modest cake, 3 tiers instead of the 5 I had once dreamed about. A modest playlist that my mother had approved, item by item, in a long email exchange the week before. As though joy itself needed to be rationed out in careful, pre-measured doses. I remember standing in the small dressing room before the ceremony, looking at myself in a mirror that had a thin crack running through the corner, and thinking, this is not the wedding I dreamed of, but it will still be my wedding. It will still be the day I marry the man I love. And no guest list, however small, can take that away from me. I told myself that happiness doesn't need an audience to be real. I believed it, mostly the way you believe things you're actively trying to convince yourself of. My mother came in to help me with my veil, her hands trembling slightly as she pinned it into place. For a moment, just a moment, something in her face softened into something that looked almost like grief. I wanted this to be perfect for you, she said quietly, not quite meeting my eyes in the mirror. I don't think I know how to do that the way I meant to. It was the closest she had come, in the entire engagement, to admitting that something was wrong. I wanted to ask her, right then, what she meant. But the wedding coordinator knocked on the door, and the moment slipped away, unexamined, the way so many moments had slipped away that year. Aiden looked steady when I saw him at the altar. Steady in the way he always was, hands folded, eyes finding mine and staying there unwavering. If he felt the smallness of the room, the thinness of the guest list, the careful absence of celebration in the air, he didn't show it. He looked at me like I was the only person in the world worth looking at. And for a few minutes, standing across from him while a rented officiant read words I barely heard over the sound of my own heartbeat, that was enough to make the room feel full. It was during the reception, a term I used generously, because it was closer to a quiet gathering with folding chairs and catered trays than anything resembling celebration, that everything changed. My father's company had a policy of small courtesy gifts for employees' major life events, and as a formality, someone from HR had informed my father's direct supervisor of the date, expecting nothing more than a card and perhaps a modest gift basket. I don't think my father expected him to actually come in person. I don't think my father wanted him to come. But show up he did, a little after 7 in the evening, when the light outside was just beginning to soften into gold. A tall, silver-haired man named Mr. Whitfield, my father's boss for the last 11 years. A man my father spoke about at home with a mixture of respect and quiet dread, the way you speak about weather systems, forces to be managed rather than people to be known. I watched my father's face when Mr. Whitfield walked through the door. It went the color of old paper. "Sir," my father said, standing so fast his folding chair nearly toppled backward. We didn't expect." I know, Mr. Whitfield said warmly, clapping my father on the shoulder with the easy confidence of a man who has never once worried about being unwelcome anywhere. "I wasn't going to miss it. Small affair, I hear, but a wedding's a wedding, and you've been with us 11 years. Wouldn't have felt right, not stopping by." He smiled at my mother, who returned it with the tight, brittle politeness of someone doing long division in her head, calculating exits, calculating damage. "Where's the happy couple? I brought a little something." That's when he saw Aiden, standing beside me near the small, understated cake table, his hand resting lightly at the small of my back. I want to describe this moment carefully, because it happened in real time, and I have relived it in slow motion more times than I can count since. Mr. Whitfield's eyes moved from me to Aiden, and something in his face simply stopped, like a film reel catching on a single frame. His polite party smile froze halfway, not quite finished, not quite abandoned. "Aiden," he said. Not a greeting. A question, laced with a disbelief so sharp it silenced the small murmur of conversation around us. "Aiden Cole?" The room, small as it was, seemed to hold its breath collectively, the way a room does right before something breaks. Aiden's expression shifted, not into panic, but into the calm, resigned look of a man who has just been recognized somewhere he didn't expect to be recognized, and has decided, in the space of a single heartbeat, That there is no point pretending otherwise, no graceful way to fold the truth back into hiding now that it has already begun unfolding itself. "Hello, Richard," Aidan said quietly. "Richard. Not sir. Not Mr. Whitfield." A first name, said with the easy, level familiarity of equals. Said like they had history because as it turned out, they did. My father's boss let out a short, disbelieving laugh, the sound of a man rearranging an entire understanding of reality in real time, and turned to my father with wide, incredulous eyes. "You didn't tell me your son-in-law was the Aidan Cole, the one who restructured the entire Western Freight contract 2 years ago, the one our board spent 6 months trying to get on a call with, and could never quite pin down?" He turned back to Aidan, shaking his head slowly, delighted in the particular way people are delighted when they stumble onto a secret they never expected to find. "I sat across the negotiating table from your firm for 4 months, Aidan. For months, and your people nearly ate our lunch on those terms. Best deal we struck all year, and I still don't fully understand how you did it. I had no idea at all, that this was the man my own employee's daughter was marrying." I felt the room tilt, actually tilt, the way rooms do in dreams right before you wake up. My mother's face had gone the exact color of the tablecloth behind her. My father was standing very, very still, the way people stand when they are trying to disappear without moving, without drawing further attention to the exact shape of the hole opening up beneath his feet. "I don't understand," my mother said faintly, her voice barely above a whisper, though I think, even in that moment, some part of her already understood everything, had perhaps understood it for months without letting herself look at it directly. Mr. Whitfield, still riding the high of his own discovery, kept talking, entirely oblivious to the quiet devastation unfolding in front of him. He talked about Aidan's company, a logistics and infrastructure consulting firm that Aidan had helped build, over nearly 8 years, from a 2-person operation working out of a rented office above a laundromat into a firm that now negotiated contracts with companies exactly like the one my father had spent 2 decades of his life working for. He talked about a merger that had nearly fallen through the previous spring, salvaged, apparently, almost entirely by Aidan's own late-night intervention. He talked about a reputation in the industry that apparently preceded Aidan into every boardroom in the region. Every room, it turned out, except my own family's kitchen. Consulting. My mother had called it, all those months ago, with that same thin, polite smile she reserved for things she'd already decided weren't worth her curiosity. She had not, in the narrowest technical sense, been wrong. She had simply never once asked what kind. I looked at Aidan. He wasn't smiling in triumph, wasn't savoring the moment the way a lesser man might have. He looked, if anything, a little tired. The particular tiredness of a man whose carefully guarded privacy has just been torn open in the worst possible way, in front of the exact people who had spent a year quietly underestimating him. "Well," Mr. Whitfield said, finally seeming to register the strange, heavy silence that had settled over the small gathering. "The way a man realizes too late he has walked into the middle of something he doesn't fully understand. I feel I've perhaps said too much. I only meant it as a compliment." He looked between my father's ashen face and my mother's frozen one, some awareness finally dawning behind his eyes. "You did know, didn't you? Surely you knew who your daughter was marrying." Nobody answered him. "I should let you all get back to celebrating," Mr. Whitfield said, more quietly now, sensing the shift in the air even if he couldn't name its cause. He shook Aidan's hand warmly, promised a proper celebratory dinner soon, once things settle, offered my father an awkward, sympathetic nod, and let himself out into the deepening evening, entirely unaware of the wreckage he was leaving behind him. The silence that followed his departure was worse than any argument could have been. "Why didn't you tell them?" I asked Aidan later, once the small remaining guests had drifted into their own quiet, whispering clusters, once my parents had retreated into a stunned, wordless corner near the gift table, unable to look at each other, unable to look at me. Aidan took my hand, his thumb tracing slow circles over my knuckles, a familiar gesture that had always calmed me and, in that moment, felt like the only steady thing left in the room. "Because I wanted them to want me for who I was sitting across the dinner table," he said quietly. "Not for what I could offer your father's career, or your family's standing. I've seen what that does to people growing up. I watched money change how people looked at my own father overnight. I didn't want to be a bargaining chip in your family. I wanted to be your husband. Chosen for exactly the reasons a husband should be chosen. It was, in its own way, the kindest and most devastating thing he could have said, because it meant the humiliation unfolding in front of us wasn't his fault at all. It was entirely, completely, the shape my parents' own assumptions had built for themselves, brick by careful brick, over the course of an entire year. I want to be honest about what I felt in the hours after that reveal, because it wasn't triumph. It wasn't the clean, satisfying vindication you might expect from a story like this one. The kind where the villain gets their comeuppance and the credits roll over a swelling soundtrack. It was grief. A deep, complicated, exhausting grief. I grieved the version of my wedding that could have existed if my parents had simply trusted me. Trusted that I loved a good man, regardless of his job title, regardless of what he could or couldn't offer them socially. I grieved the year of quiet shame I had absorbed on Aiden's behalf, defending him in rooms he wasn't even present in, telling myself careful stories about practicality and stress that were really just my own refusal to see my parents clearly, to name what was actually happening while it was still happening. I grieved, most of all, the guest list. Not because I cared about numbers or opulence for their own sake, but because every single name my mother had crossed out represented a person who would never get to witness the version of that day that should have existed. Full, loud, unapologetically joyful, surrounded by everyone who actually loved us. My mother found me alone near the coat room an hour later, twisting her hands the way she always did before a difficult confession, a habit I recognized from 100 childhood memories of being caught in small lies. "We didn't know," she said, her voice small. "About his company. About any of it, I swear to you." "I know you didn't," I said, and I heard my own voice come out flatter and harder than I intended, though I didn't take it back. "That's exactly the problem, Mom. You didn't know because you never bothered to ask. You decided who Aiden was within the first 10 minutes of meeting him, and you never once revisited that decision, not for an entire year." "That's not fair," she whispered. "No," I agreed. "It's not fair. None of this year has been fair. Not to me. Not to him." My father appeared behind her then, his face still ashen, still visibly catching up to a version of reality that had rearranged itself entirely in the space of a single sentence from his own boss. "I didn't want him at the wedding," he admitted quietly, meaning Mr. Whitfield, not Aiden, though the distinction hardly mattered anymore. "I was afraid he'd see how small everything was. How small we were, compared to what I imagined he expected. I was ashamed, and I let that shame decide how I treated my own daughter's wedding, and I am only now understanding how badly I got it wrong." "You were ashamed of the wrong thing," I told him, and something in his face cracked open at that, some old, defended wall finally giving way. "You spent this entire year protecting yourself from an embarrassment that only existed inside your own head. And in the process, you humiliated the man I love and made me feel like my own happiness was something to be managed rather than celebrated." I walked away from both of them that night without resolution fully offered, without forgiveness fully extended, without the kind of clean, tidy closure that makes for a satisfying story. Some wounds don't heal in a single conversation, however honest. Some truths need time to be sat with, turned over, examined from every angle, before they can be genuinely repaired rather than just papered over. In the weeks that followed, something strange and quiet happened inside my parents' house, a slow, uncomfortable reckoning that unfolded largely without my direct involvement. Relayed to me later in fragments by my mother, and once, memorably, by my father himself. My father's colleagues, once so carefully excluded from the guest list, began hearing the story anyway. The way office stories always travel, growing a little larger, a little more dramatic, in each retelling. My father, instead of experiencing the humiliation he had spent an entire year trying to avoid, found himself, to his own visible and uncomfortable surprise, elevated by it. His daughter had married Aiden Cole. People who had barely acknowledged him in hallways for years suddenly began stopping by his desk, asking, with poorly disguised curiosity, what Aiden was really like, whether my father could perhaps put in a good word, whether there might be an opportunity to meet. I watched my father wrestle with this new attention over the following months. torn visibly between the shame of how he had actually behaved and the strange, unearned pride now being handed to him by the very same people whose judgment he had spent an entire year fearing. I think, in some private corner of himself, he began to understand, slowly, uncomfortably, the way understanding often arrives when it's inconvenient, that the sudden respect he was receiving was built on the exact same shallow foundation that had made him hide Aiden from view in the first place. That realization, more than anything I could have said to him directly, began to crack something open in him that a year of careful conversations never quite managed to reach. He came to my apartment alone one evening in late autumn, several months after the wedding, without calling first, which was so unlike him that I nearly didn't recognize his knock. "I've been thinking about the garage," he said, once he was sitting at my small kitchen table, turning a mug of tea in slow circles without drinking from it. "The day you asked me about the crossed-out names, and I told you it was complicated, and I picked the wrench back up instead of answering you properly." "I remember," I said. "I was ashamed," he said again, but this time the word came out with more weight, more specificity, as though he had spent months excavating exactly what it meant. "Not of Aiden. Of myself. I spent 20 years at that company watching men with better degrees and better last names get promoted past me, watching them get invited to things I was never invited to. And somewhere along the way, I think I decided that the only thing I could control was making sure nobody from that world ever saw how small my own life actually was. Your wedding felt like a risk I couldn't afford to take. I'm sorry. I know that's not a good enough reason. I don't think there is a good enough reason, but it's the true one." It was the most honest thing my father had ever said to me, and I sat with it for a long moment before I answered. "You didn't just protect yourself, Dad," I said gently. "You made Aiden carry the weight of a shame that was never his to carry. He spent an entire year being quietly diminished for something he never did." "I know," my father said. "I owe him an apology bigger than anything I've ever had to give anyone." My mother took longer than my father to arrive at anything resembling real accountability. Shame doesn't move quickly in people who have spent a lifetime building walls against it, brick by careful brick, and my mother had been building hers for far longer than I had ever fully understood. But 3 months after the wedding, she called me on a Sunday afternoon and asked, quietly, almost shyly, if she and my father could take Aiden and me to dinner. Not a large gathering. Not a showy gesture designed to compensate publicly for a private failure. Just the 4 of us, at a small restaurant we'd gone to for my birthday years earlier, back when I was still a teenager and none of this had happened yet. "I owe him an apology," she said over the phone, her voice steadier than I expected. "A real one. Not because of who he turned out to be, or what he's built, or what people at your father's office now think of us. Because of who he always was underneath all of that. And I never once bothered to actually see it. I looked at his shirts and his old car and I made a decision about his worth before I ever really talked to him. I won't pretend that dinner erased an entire year of quiet exclusion. It didn't, and I don't think it was meant to. Some scars stay, faint but present. Reminders of the exact shape of the wound even after the wound itself has closed. But it was a genuine beginning. My mother apologized to Aiden directly that evening, without excuses woven into the apology, without the word circumstances appearing anywhere in her sentences. She asked him real questions for the first time in over a year, about his childhood, about his father's hardware shop, about what he actually wanted his life to look like in 10 years. And she listened to his answers the way Aiden's own mother had once listened to hers, with genuine, unhurried curiosity rather than quiet calculation. My father, in his own halting way, admitted at that same dinner that he had let fear of other people's judgment decide how he treated his own daughter's happiness, and that it was a mistake he intended to spend the rest of his life correcting, one honest gesture at a time, starting with introducing Aiden properly to every single colleague he had once so carefully excluded. As for the revenge in this story, if you want to call it that, though I've never quite been comfortable with the word, it was never loud. There was no scene staged for dramatic effect. No cruelty deliberately returned for cruelty received. No moment where I stood up at a family gathering and delivered a triumphant speech while my parents wept with regret in front of an audience. The universe, or perhaps simply the truth, did the unmasking entirely on its own, in a rented banquet hall, through the mouth of a man who had absolutely no idea he was detonating anything at all when he walked through the door with a gift basket and a warm smile. My only real choice, once the dust had settled and the initial shock had worn thin, was what to do with what had been revealed. I could have used it as a weapon, could have spent years reminding my parents, in ways subtle and not so subtle, of exactly how wrong they had been, letting the humiliation of that reception fester into a permanent, simmering resentment I brought out at every family gathering for the rest of our lives. I chose something else instead. I chose honesty, delivered directly, without cruelty but also without softening it into something smaller and easier to swallow than it deserved to be. I chose to name what had happened instead of quietly absorbing it the way I had absorbed so much that year. I chose a husband who had never once needed anyone's approval to know his own worth, and who taught me, without ever raising his voice, that dignity doesn't require an audience to be real, that the quietest kind of strength is often the one that never needs to announce itself at all. It has been almost 2 years since that wedding. My parents and Aiden have, slowly and imperfectly, built something resembling real warmth between them. Not the performed warmth of that first careful dinner, but something that has grown roots over time, through repeated small gestures, through my father genuinely asking Aiden for advice now instead of merely tolerating his presence, through my mother learning to cook one of Priya's recipes and bringing it, a little nervously, to a family dinner as her own quiet form of apology. My father retired from his company last spring, after 23 years, and at his farewell gathering, a gathering he insisted, this time on inviting everyone to every colleague, every name that had once been crossed off a different list entirely. He stood up and gave a short, unpolished speech about the mistakes he'd made over the years, including, he said, looking directly at me across the room, letting fear decide things that should have been decided by love. It wasn't a perfect speech. It didn't need to be. If there's a lesson in this story, and I think there is, it isn't really about status, or money, or the sweet, satisfying sensation of watching people who once underestimated you eat their own words. It's simpler than that, and in some ways harder to sit with. The people who love us can still fail to see us clearly, especially when their own fears get tangled up in the way they look at us. Fear makes people small in ways that have nothing to do with the size of their bank accounts. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in response isn't loud revenge at all. It's simply refusing to shrink yourself to fit inside someone else's smaller, more frightened idea of what your life, or your love, should look like. My wedding was never a little party. It was the day I learned exactly how much room I was willing to keep taking up in my own life, no matter who was, or wasn't, fully present in that room to witness it. It was the day I discovered that the man I had chosen never needed a title recognized by a stranger to be worthy of love. He had been worthy of it all along, in his crack-taped laptop and his 3 rotating shirts and his careful, patient silence, and it took the rest of us far too long to catch up to a truth he had known about himself the entire time. And that, in the end, was worth more than any guest list my mother could ever have written, longer or shorter, than the one we actually had.